Bonjour et bienvenue. Hello and welcome to International Assistance and COVID-19 Researcher Perspectives. My name is Kate Grantham and I'm the Vice President of the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development, or CASID. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which is the final event in a collaboration between CASID and Global Affairs Canada to connect departmental officials with timely and relevant evidence generated by leading Canadian and global international assistance researchers, as well as to amplify the reach and impact of research generated by these experts in the field. Today, we will be discussing a forward-looking research agenda for international assistance in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. A panel of academic research experts will discuss ways forward on issues such as health, gender equality, education, and food security. But before we commence, I would like to introduce Drew Smith, the Director General of International Assistance Policy at Global Affairs Canada, to make some opening remarks. Drew will then hand things over to Dr. Liam Swiss, who is the president of CASID. Please kick things off for us, Drew.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je suis ravi d'être avec vous aujourd'hui pour cet événement virtuel qui est le fruit d'une collaboration entre l'Association canadienne des études du développement international et Affaires mondiales Canada. Une collaboration qui vise à établir des liens entre les collègues des ministères et des chercheurs afin de contribuer à développer des politiques et des programmes d'aide internationale informés par les données et la recherche, comme la politique féministe d'aide internationale du Canada nous invite à le faire de façon proactive. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be here with you today to open this virtual event, which is part of a collaboration, as Liam was noting, between the Canadian Association for the Study of International Development, or CASID, and Global Affairs Canada through the International Assistance Research and Knowledge Division. This collaboration seeks to connect departmental officials with timely and relevant evidence generated by leading Canadian and global international assistance researchers, which I think today is an excellent example of this collaboration. As well, it intends to amplify the reach and impact of research generated by these experts in the field. Indeed, in addition to shining a spotlight on women and girls, gender equality and inclusion of vulnerable and marginalized people, Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy aims to promote innovation and seeks to foster greater development effectiveness through our policies and programs, of which this kind of partnership is essential, I would argue. To this end, the policy challenges, the Feminist International Assistance Policy, that is, challenges us to engage more closely with research organizations and researchers and to seek data and evidence to inform decision-making processes. Our engagement with CASID is one such effort. The effects of COVID-19 on communities around the world have been profound and swift, deepening existing inequalities and disproportionately impacting women and girls, among other vulnerable groups. Since February 2020, the Government of Canada has announced over $1.5 billion to support the global response to COVID-19. Canada is aiming to make strategic investments where its international assistance can have the greatest impact for the world's poorest and most marginalized, with a focus on women and girls as per our feminist policy. Global cooperation has become more important than ever, we would argue, and provides an opportunity to reach out to traditional, or rather to non-traditional partners, in addition to existing allies. This is particularly important given the current geopolitical context, with great powers jockeying for position, authoritarians seeking to exploit disruptions, and weaken confidence in multilateral processes and the rules-based system. There is an opening for middle powers like Canada to fill this space through leadership. La nécessité de la coopération au niveau mondial est encore plus importante en ces temps de pandémie de COVID-19 et fournit l'occasion de travailler avec de nouveaux partenaires en plus de nos partenaires traditionnels. La pandémie soulève aussi d'importantes questions pour l'aide internationale que nous allons explorer dans ce webinaire. Les panélistes se penchent notamment sur les questions de santé, le rôle fondamental des données dans notre compréhension des impacts, y compris en termes d'inégalité et de vulnérabilité et de leur dimension intersectionnelle. Et notre capacité de développer des réponses adéquates et efficaces en termes de politique et de programme. The pandemic raises important questions for the international assistance sector, which this webinar will explore. Among them are, what are the emerging health, social, and economic issues and challenges that are preoccupying policymakers everywhere, and including in the global south? What are the data, knowledge, and evidence gaps that require research so that policies and programs responding to COVID-19 are evidence-informed? And this includes questions around the fluidity of the COVID pandemic and how it's highlighted the need for timely data to formulate appropriate and effective policy and programming responses. The relevance of and need of disaggregated data with regards to gender, but also different dimensions different dimensions for identity is also getting more attention, not only in institutional circles where it had been recognized as a challenge for implementing a truly intersectional analysis, but also in the general public, as is emerging in discussions of systemic racism and the lived experience of racialized and indigenous people. Finally, we'd like to take some time to explore what contributions research and researchers can make to the global recovery and future approaches to international assistance. As we look over the horizon, we welcome your thoughts and hope that this webinar contributes to this ongoing conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you and look forward to the upcoming discussion and turn it back to Liam. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Drew. I know we at CASET are very happy to see Global Affairs' keen investment and interest in development research in Canada and beyond, and especially in the context of the COVID crisis. So on behalf of CASET, I'm very happy to introduce our esteemed moderator for today. She is Dr. Nalima Golrajani. Nalima is a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in London, UK, and an associate fellow at King's College, Department of International Development, also in London. Originally from Montreal, she's currently on secondment at the Canadian International Council and the G20 Research Group at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. Dr. Golrajani is one of the world's leading experts on management and politics of aid agencies, and we're very fortunate to have her here to facilitate our discussions today. So over to you, Nalima.
Thanks, Liam. Merci à tous pour cette invitation. Je serai en fait la modératrice pour cette session et je suis ravie d'être parmi vous pour environ 1h30. Alors, je pense qu'on va arrêter vers 1h25 pour qu'on puisse continuer au EGM de l'Association canadienne d'études du développement international. Cette session, comme vous avez entendu, fait partie d'une collaboration entre Affaires mondiales et AECID. Et c'est en fait le dernier événement de ce partenariat qui en fait amène questions de recherche avec des questions de politique canadienne vers le développement international. And in some way, I feel really ideally placed to be moderating this conversation because I feel my entire career has essentially been moderating these two worlds of research and policy, engaging both with different worldviews, different timelines, different incentive structures that exist sometimes across these two communities. So I'm thrilled to be here today with you. Like I said, we have until about 1:25 before the AGM, and I would welcome questions in both English and French. I believe the questions are posed in English on the slides because there was some difficulty finding the translator to translate them, but feel free to ask your questions and I'm happy to translate them for those panelists who feel more comfortable understanding the question in English. So I'm joined today by a very, very distinguished panel of academics who are effectively crossing this divide between research and policy on a regular basis. And I will introduce each one shortly, but before I do so, I was invited to provide a few remarks to sort of kick off some of the more micro level focus of the questions that follow. And I want to take a step back and try and think about COVID-19 and this global pandemic in terms of both a twin crisis, a crisis of health, clearly, and also an economic crisis. And these twin crises, I think, highlight some challenges in the global system today, as Drew pointed out. The challenge of the inequality of the effects of the health crisis, some serious challenges to the rules-based international order, and with the inequality challenge, the kind of sub-challenge of race and power and how those interact with inequality in particular. I also think we are potentially seeing a change in values and the emphasis and the value we placed on global cooperation more generally. At the macro level, I think we see the rise of nationalism filtering into the way we do development and the way we justify the rationale for development. But on the other hand, I think at the micro level, I'm more optimistic. I think the evidence we have of movements like the caremongering movement here in Canada that has now become a global movement suggests a degree of altruism, let's say, that still exists that I think can be leveraged within our international policy. I'd like to just talk about two impacts for research. I think the first impact of this crisis for research, I think the most obvious one is it is creating new lines of inquiry due to the disruptions that all fields really face as a result of the crisis. I think it's also creating new fields of research entirely. And one can think about, for example, the way public health imperatives interact with questions of international law, including limitations on the freedom of movement, that I think are really a rich area where there hasn't been too much work. I think we're thinking about new methods or seeing new methods for data collection in particular, resulting from difficulties around the ability to engage in direct field work, the role of survey data, in particular telephone interviews. And I also think we're seeing greater openness and transparency. I think geography and financial means are no longer the impediments to participation in, for example, things like the conference circuit that many researchers must engage with for career advancement. So I think there's definitely an impact for research. I think also, we're seeing for research, in the research context, shifting power and resources to those closest to development challenges that we're trying to address. And I think that's a welcome change for many of us. And I think it's possibly challenging sort of North-centric frameworks and practices that need challenging, but the challenge is really coming from this external shock. For aid policy and how that interacts with research, I think there are also a number of effects that we might want to consider. The first is just straight up the fall in GNI ratios, which for many countries will mean a fall in the overall aid budget. And we can see that, very clearly in the UK, where, recently there have been talk of up to 30% cuts in the ODA budget, and they are now undertaking a very extensive process of looking where to cut. I think that fall in GNI has two effects. It has effects for programming. I think it also has effects potentially for the role of experts and expertise in development agencies. And certainly the merger in the UK context of DFID with the FCO is really making that a live issue. I think as well, the need for speed and rapid response has a potential risk for research, potentially devalues research that might look backwards, perhaps to shape future policy, and it potentially deprioritizes real-time research that seems a luxury in the context of crisis. People are clearly busy, in some cases overwhelmed, and I think one needs to guard against those potential risks. And that being said, I think conversations like this are important to maintain momentum for applied policy research. And I think this crisis really draws the interests of development policy and research much closer, and I hope we'll get into that in what follows. So I'd like to just start now by introducing the panelists. The approach we're going to take is we have 4 questions we'd like to discuss, and we're going to spend around 10 minutes per question. after which we will take some Q&A. So we'll try and save the Q&As at the end, but feel free to enter your questions into the box below your screen as they arise in your head, but we will look at those questions largely at the end of the session. So first I'd like to introduce Jennifer Clapp. Dr. Clapp is Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. She's the author of 3 books in the area of financialization in food and the politics of food aid, as well as a member of the high-level UN panel on food security. Next, I'd like to also introduce Prachi Srivastava. She's Associate Professor at the Faculty of Education at Western University, and her area of research is largely global development and education. She's a member of the World Bank Expert Advisory Council on Citizen Engagement, and is really now looking at the effects of COVID-19 on this global education emergency. She's also leading a brief for the T20 think tank force on education that will feed into the G20 summit. And next, or lastly, I guess as well, I'd like to invite or introduce Julia Smith. Julia is Research Associate in the Faculty of Health Science at Simon Fraser University. She's co-leading a major study on gendered impacts of COVID-19 with funding with the Bill and Melinda, from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as CIHR. So I'd like to thank you all for being here today. And I guess let's just jump right in now with the first question. So I will read out the question, and so let me start there. So the question is, what are some of the emerging challenges, new or newly considered, brought by COVID-19 in your area of research, be it gender equality, education, food security, or otherwise? Julia, perhaps you could kick us off?
Sure, I'd be pleased to. And Kate, if I could share my screen, I can share some infographics that might kind of help set the scene for this. And before I start, I just want to note that I am on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam here at Simon Fraser University. So, as mentioned, I am leading a project on gender and COVID, funded by CIHR and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I mean, what we're seeing, and I'm sure many of you are aware of, is that COVID is exacerbating pre-existing inequalities. And not only is COVID as a health crisis exacerbating these, but the response can also be exacerbating these. Now let me see if I can just share my screen. Here we go. So I thought this might be a good place to start. And this is from a brief that was just published by UN Women along with the Gender and COVID Project. Let's see if we can do this. Oh well. Yesterday. So it's brand new, fresh off the press, and I thought it provided some good infographics. Can you all see that quickly? Nalima, can you nod your head? Yeah, okay. Just to kind of set the scene about some of the impacts that are being felt. And I think one, that we're really noticing that is quite distinct is right here. And that's 3 times the number of female healthcare workers are being infected with COVID compared to men. And women really are on the front lines of this response, both in the health field and in lots of the other kind of frontline industries. Sorry. Let's just shift down here. Another impact, which I'm sure Dr. Clapp is going to speak about, is, oh, sorry, I'm getting my people mixed up here, but anyways, one of the other impacts will be the impact on education. So we know a lot of children are out of school because of COVID, and this can have a direct impact specifically on girls' education, as we see in a lot of contexts, they already face a lot of barriers. An interesting and troubling trend here also relates to the digital divide in different countries. So how many countries are able to move learning online, and who within countries is able to access that learning? Some of the preliminary results from our research have also shown that in households where there's, for example, only one device for online learning, that device may be given to the older child or the boy child over the girl child. And so there's a digital divide going on that's geographic and is also gendered. Also, a lot of households where there's a single parent, and most of those households are headed by women, have less access to technology for online learning. There's been a fair bit of attention around interpersonal violence and COVID. So here's another challenge, and we're really seeing higher rates of interpersonal violence related to the lockdown measures and social distancing around the world, in countries ranging from Canada to Panama to Kenya to Malaysia. This is a troubling global phenomenon. It's important here to recognize that not only are women and girls disproportionately affected by this type of violence, but so are people living with disabilities and non-binary people and transgender people. In the majority of countries where we have data, women are overrepresented in informal economies, and these economies have fallen by 60% just during the first impact of the pandemic. So we're seeing a very disproportionate impact on women as workers and on the economic sectors where women are overrepresented. We're also seeing, as I mentioned again, that women are really in many of the essential occupations. And again, this is, really something that we're seeing around the world. And then a final challenge I just would like to raise here, is the impact on access to other health services and how health systems are being completely strained. And this will impact women and girls' access to sexual and reproductive health, transgender people's access to health. We're seeing access to abortion being limited in the context of this pandemic. And so I'm just going to close there. It's a kind of brief overview of some of the challenges we're seeing related to gender and COVID at this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Jennifer, Prachi, would either of you like to jump in on that?
I can just quickly comment a little bit, picking up a little bit from Julia's comments. I mean, I think one of the issues here is to, at least in the area of education, to realize that in education, we're seeing, obviously globally, we're seeing patterns that we've never seen in at least in our memories. But in education, we really are seeing what is, there's no way of putting it, the largest global mass disruption of education, formal education we have ever witnessed. It affects an entire generation. It is going to have serious consequences for the next generation of children and young people. And it is cross-cutting. So all of these questions around gender equality, food security, health issues, when we think about international assistance and in terms of financing and partnerships, all of this is going to affect the way that we are able to sustainably recover. And the great tragedy of this is that in the last 20 years, and particularly in the last, between 2000 and 2010 in particular, but then following on that, we saw education enjoyed the largest kind of increase of enrollments, the largest increase of inclusion. Not to say that there weren't gaps. There were always gaps, and there were gaps in every country, including high-income countries, including here in Canada. But globally, we were coming into this emergency on average in terms of a pretty good situation. Globally on average. Again, we can talk specifics in different contexts, and in some contexts, we were actually very far behind. So the tragedy of this in terms of what we're seeing for education is firstly a knee-jerk response to looking at online learning as the way that we're going to secure education for children. And that really is a knee-jerk response. And I think that was led primarily by this, focus in many high-income countries who have not been ever used to planning for crises and who have not been used to crisis planning in education. Whereas in countries that have been much more attuned to crisis planning for education, either as a system or for groups of particular, participants and households who've been left out due to conflict, due to emergencies, due to other health disaster, pandemics or epidemics, we've seen actually different responses, differentiated responses. So I think in education, it's not as And I think that it's true for all our sectors, but I think in education, given the prominence of the fact that it affects every aspect of our lives, it affects of course outcomes, it affects of course labor market participation, it affects labor market participation of adults. If children are at school, are at home, what does that mean in terms of labor participation of the working population, many of whom are also having childcare and other caring responsibilities? But what does that mean in terms of safe and sustainable reopening of systems? And without having a very systematic, sustainable health response, global health response, it is very difficult to start thinking of how we will reopen and guarantee those rights, fundamental rights in all our areas, but in particular in education, because that's what I'm looking at. So I'll stop there, and I'll pick up some of those points in the other questions.
Great, thanks, Prachi. Jennifer, can I invite you to offer some thoughts?
Sure, thank you. And I'm reminded by Julia and Prachi's comments about how these issues of gender equality, education, and food security really intersect in complex ways. It's important to recognize. In the area of food security, which is the area I research, the COVID-19 pandemic has really raised some big challenges. And we were already facing enormous challenges in this area prior to the pandemic. We were already not close to meeting SDG 2 on zero hunger. There were over 820 million people chronically undernourished in the world prior to the outbreak of the virus. And now the World Food Program is predicting that an additional 130 million people are likely to be facing acute hunger by the end of the year. And acute hunger means brink of starvation. And that number is already 135 million people in that situation. So it's likely to double the number of people who are really facing severe food insecurity. And the research that I've been doing through the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition was already looking at some of the challenges of meeting SDG 2. And of course, the outbreak of the pandemic really forced us to focus our research in terms of looking at the impact of the pandemic specifically. And if I could share my screen, I just want to talk about three big pathways through which we've seen food insecurity impacted, hopefully everyone can see that, by the pandemic. So on the one hand, we've seen disrupted supply chains. That was sort of an immediate impact of the lockdowns. We've seen illnesses among workers, migrant farm workers and factory workers at meatpacking plants, as well as school closures, which cut off children from school feeding programs. And that is one sort of channel, this kind of disruption to the normal supply chains for food that have affected people's ability to access food. But we also have to take into consideration the broader economic recession and rising rates of poverty that are also affecting people's ability to access food. The World Bank is estimating that between 70 and 100 million people will be pushed into extreme poverty by the end of the year. And that is really affecting people's purchasing power and ability to acquire foods on markets. And it's important to point this out because a lot of the information that we're hearing from the Food and Agriculture Organization, for example, is trying to reassure us that global cereal stocks, for example, are in good shape. It's not like the food crisis of 2008, where there was a concern about how much cereal and grains were being produced in the world. We do have, full granaries. The problem is people can't access it because they're losing their livelihoods, they're losing their income. So that's a serious problem. And in fact, food prices have been, they fell initially. They're starting to tick up a little bit, but they fell because of the closure of restaurants, lockdowns, et cetera, which really put, made it difficult for farmers to get their products to market, but it also resulted in reduced demand. But there's a third big channel through which food security is affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the broader macroeconomic effects, sort of the knock-on effects from this global recession. And what we're seeing is some of the world's poorest countries that rely on exports of primary commodities, for example, or that rely on tourism for their foreign exchange. Because of the drop in world commodity prices, because of the declining demand for international travel, we're seeing currencies in those countries actually experiencing depreciation. Their values are falling, which if those countries rely on imported food, and many countries that rely on commodity exports also rely on food imports, that makes the local prices for that imported food more expensive in the local currency. So we're seeing all kinds of effects where it's difficult to get food to markets, people don't have money to buy the food, and then in some instances, food prices, although they're falling on a global scale, they're actually rising in specific local communities. So it's a really complicated picture, but it's concerning because it's very difficult to generalize in a broad sense about what to do about it. So I'll just stop there with those comments and circle back to what some of the policy options might be.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. I think from all three of you, what I'm hearing is that this crisis has the potential for exacerbating inequalities, but perhaps from Prachi, a little more optimism about the resilience of lower income countries, given the kind of ongoing challenge of education in those contexts. So there was sort of more of a note of optimism perhaps from you, Prachi, but notwithstanding really some concern about how this translates, for example, into the labor market participation rates. So great. With that, could we move to the second question? Great. So the second question really is two questions. And the first part is, what are some of the data, knowledge, and evidence gaps stemming from COVID-19 that require additional research to fill? And part two, are current research and data collection efforts capable of capturing the gendered and intersectional impacts of the pandemic? Prachi, perhaps you can kick us off on this question, on these questions, or one part of the two questions.
Sure. I'm gonna preface the comments by saying that most of my comments are global and on average, and I think it's really, really important to understand the context, because by no means am I saying that we entered this pandemic in education globally in great shape. In fact, we entered globally in the sense in terms of having seen the highest level of enrollments, but we also entered with a 68 million teacher shortage. So we entered the pandemic with 68 million teachers that were in undersupply. And this is globally. In certain areas, of course, we have oversupplies. In certain subjects, we have oversupplies. In certain other sectors, we have oversupply. In certain areas, we have severe undersupply. And in many of those instances, we're talking about low middle income countries. We also entered this pandemic with a severe underfinancing of education, both internationally in terms of ODA, and Canada has not been great in terms of its ODA commitments generally overall, but also domestically, 1 in 4 countries did not meet the financing targets that have internationally been agreed. And again, going back to some of the comments that Jennifer has made in terms of the macroeconomic impacts of this, we are likely to see, again, some drop in financing, both in terms of ODA, but also in terms of domestic financing. That's going to be tragic. The reason why I say it's tragic is because all of the action and all of these estimates and these data globally, again, have been accounted for in terms of children, the majority of children in school, and 250 million children out of school, right? So we already entered this pandemic with 250 million children out of school. And all of the targets and all of the SDG 4 targets, and in terms of kind of understanding the additional impact of that, was calculated based on the idea that we have X number of children who are out of school, and what do we do in terms of getting them in school and keeping the status quo to go through the system. We are now, in just 3 months or 4 months, or you know, whenever it is we want to take that beginning to be the time frame, we are now in a situation where we are talking about almost 100% of children whose educations have been affected. I cannot overstate what that means. If we were unable to move the needle, thinking about 250 million children, we are now talking about 1.8 billion children and young people. There is no other way. And this problem keeps me up at night. It has kept me up at night since February. So what are some of the data? What are the knowledge and evidence gaps? Well, we know that some of the immediate data are what is the impact of COVID-19 in terms of on households? What is that impact going to be on children and young people? But not just in terms of learning, of course, in terms of learning. I have a feeling we're going to be able to measure learning gains and losses more easily than we are going to be able to measure the impact of this or really ascertain the impact of this in terms of life chances, in terms of security, in terms of what this is going to mean for long-term recovery. What is this going to mean for health security, for food security of those households? And children are under the care and protection of households until they are adults. So until we can actually ascertain the impact of that, we will not actually know. My feeling is that in terms of really understanding the impact, we are not going to really understand the impact of this for a good number of years, maybe a generation. What we can do in the interim is focus on constructing plans, constructing policies that are, to the best of our ability, evidence informed. And that doesn't mean that we had no evidence going into this emergency. We do. We have evidence on what works for learning in difficult, precarious circumstances. We have policy models in terms of how do we secure some of those other services that schools and schooling provide. For example, Jennifer mentioned food and school nutrition and feeding programs. There are also therapeutic and diagnostic services, allied health services, mental health services that schools provide as hubs. So there are policy models. I just think that they're not the evidence, the policies that are being constructed, at least in where I'm sitting, and it's odd because for the first time in my career, I'm actually looking at domestic education. My whole career has been looking either at emergency education or education in the global south. But when I look at the difference in terms of the planning cycles, I'm not seeing a whole lot of policy that's being driven by real crisis sensitive planning that is evidence informed. And I'm not seeing those lessons that could be learned from contexts that have had to deal with emergencies. Yes, COVID-19 is new, but dealing with emergencies is not new. And so I'm not actually seeing those kinds of knowledge bases being mobilized and actually being mobilized from those contexts. And many of those contexts are contexts that were fundamentally more insecure, but as a result, they had much more cross-sectoral collaborative planning between different sectors, between different groups coming together.
Great, thanks Prachi. So basically the lesson to me is don't get caught up in the tyranny of averages, really. And really we need to use, we'll gather and look at the evidence in the local contextual space. So point taken. Julia, would you like to come in on this?
Sure, and I would just like to kind of follow up on what Prachi was saying in terms of are the lessons we've already documented from past crises and outbreaks being learned. And I think when it comes to the gendered impacts of health crises, we're also not demonstrating sufficient learning. So for example, earlier I mentioned that, women healthcare workers are having greater incidence of COVID infection than men healthcare workers. We know this from Ebola, right? Ebola in West Africa. But what is actually being done to protect women healthcare workers specifically? I haven't seen any examples of specific policies to do that. So we do have knowledge from the past about this, and we need to see it applied better. There's some other really big knowledge gaps when it comes to gender and infectious disease outbreaks. And one, was also mentioned in the introductory remarks, and that's having disaggregated data. And so data that's disaggregated by sex, by gender, and by other identity factors. And in response to the second question here, we are capable of collecting this data. Countries are capable of collecting this data. Health systems are capable of collecting this data, and it's not being collected very well. So in a minority of countries, we're getting sex disaggregated data, but that's it. And I mean, I just really think there's no excuse why that data is also not disaggregated by other identity factors. And that's incredibly important. A big challenge in my field around data collection is around getting better data on interpersonal violence. And this is one where I would say current research and data collection efforts are struggling. And I don't have the answer to this, but I would just say this is one area where, as a researcher and a member of a research team, we're getting a lot of requests to collect this data. Policymakers want to know, global health actors want to know, and we honestly are struggling to find the right methods and ways to collect this data in a way that is safe for the people involved and accurate. So that's a real challenge that I hope we can have some new learning around. I think another big gap in evidence is around the informal economy and the unpaid care work, where women are overrepresented. So a lot of women work in informal work where they're not being, where their work is not being recognized and counted. And this means that aid programs and development projects and economic recovery are not including them. This includes sex work. And then there's the huge burden of care work that is still being done primarily by women, that again is not being counted, is not being recognized and documented, and therefore is continuing to be exploited. I think I'll just leave it there now. Thank you.
Great. So some serious data gaps to look out for. Jennifer, do you want to come in?
Thanks. Yeah, in the area of food security, there are also data gaps, big challenges. I mean, the kinds of, and there's a risk of not being able to get the right kind of data, because the data we can get more easily are things that I had already mentioned, like world grain stocks and world average prices for certain agricultural and food commodities. And there are also projections with respect to poverty. But this crisis that we're experiencing, especially with respect to food security, is because, as I said, it's very complex. It's not the same as past food crises where food prices shot up and then, people were like, okay, food is more expensive. It's going to be harder for people to acquire, and therefore we can make projections about the impacts. But in this case, because the impacts are so varied in different locations and by different types of country, like in terms of their imports and exports, it's really important that we get better data, especially at the local level. And that's something that's particularly in developing countries that it's hard to get right now, partly because of weaker infrastructure for online surveys. Also people not wanting to necessarily, go out and talk to surveyors in person. But what we need to know is how people are experiencing their relationship with food right now, whether they're able to get to markets, whether they have enough money to buy food, how food's being distributed within households. I mean, all of that kind of information would be really valuable for us to get a better grip and understanding on how this pandemic is affecting food security in different locations. Yeah, I mean, some of that data is becoming available in places like Canada. We know now that there's been a rise in household food insecurity, and we can get that data because we can, phone people up or survey them on the internet. So, but generally that kind of data is really important in developing country contexts and in different kinds of economies. It would be great to be able to have that kind of comparative understanding of how this crisis is rippling through different parts of the world and affecting food insecurity, because that's vital for devising policy responses that are context specific. So yeah, just just to say that, you know, while we've got that access to those kind of big picture trends and data about food on world markets and prices on world markets, I think we need to get the more specific location context specific data to help us devise better responses. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So my takeaway from here is that there are some serious challenges for evidence-based policies and for sort of fine-grained data, and that perhaps the challenge is a universal one, not just limited to the global south, but shared really across both north and south. So great. Perhaps we can move to the third question. Great, I think that's it. So this again comes in two parts. From your perspective and the perspective of your research, what might these challenges and data gaps mean for international assistance, programming and policy in the aftermath of COVID-19? What are your recommendations? What will you be looking at going forward? Jennifer, would you be able to kick us off?
Sure, thanks, Nalima. Yeah, in fact, this is a great question for me because it flows directly from the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition report that we launched a couple of weeks ago, which is trying to understand how to address food security and nutrition going forward. And as I mentioned already, the COVID pandemic really was important for us to take into account as we were devising our policy recommendations. If it's okay, I might just share another slide because our report makes calls for 4 kinds of policy shifts, and because there's 4 of them and I have 3 minutes, I thought it might be easier to show it with a slide. But I'll just mention how the report, sorry, it's just waiting for that to come up, makes these recommendations for food systems generally if we want to achieve food security going forward, especially in light of COVID-19, that we need to take these 4 kinds of policy shifts together. They're not either or kinds of policy shifts, they are complementary policy shifts. And the COVID-19 pandemic really highlights why these are important. So I'll just briefly go through them. We argue that we need to move from a kind of like a past approach, which was focused on increasing agricultural supply, in other words, producing more food, to moving towards a more radical transformation of food systems as a whole, from production all the way to consumption and all the steps in between. The COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted the ways in which food systems are falling short in many respects, not just in terms of production, but also in terms of markets and distribution and opportunities for livelihoods, for agency and rights of food system participants all throughout food systems, so that we need to move towards thinking about food policy as a transformation of food systems as a whole. A second key recommendation we make is moving from simply looking at food and agriculture and food security as a sectoral issue to understanding the interconnectedness between different systems and different sectors. And the COVID-19 pandemic really shines a light here as well. The interconnectedness of the global economic system with the global food system, with the global health system is really front and center in the face of the pandemic. And if we make food policies without considering these interactions between different systems and different sectors, we will inevitably fall short. So that's a really important kind of policy shift that we call for. Another is a shift from focusing simply on reducing hunger and undernutrition to focusing on hunger and malnutrition in all its forms in their complex relationship with one another. So here what we're referring to is understanding the complex nutritional dynamics within societies where we're seeing overweight and obesity alongside hunger and undernutrition and micronutrient deficiencies. And the COVID-19 pandemic has shone a light on the reason that we need this kind of shift, because there are really complicated nutritional dynamics associated with the disease. People who are experiencing different forms of malnutrition are much more vulnerable to the disease, as just one example. And so we need to take this broader viewpoint in terms of understanding that food security is a complex, interrelated, and multi-pronged challenge. And finally, we argue that we need to shift food policies, and this applies for international assistance as well, away from trying to focus on a kind of one-size-fits-all global solution to understanding the food security and nutrition challenges are context-specific and therefore require diverse kinds of solutions. So in other words, as I already mentioned, certain countries, certain regions, they're facing different kinds of problems as a result of this pandemic. And so their food security and nutrition needs are very different. So taking these shifts as a whole, we argue is a really important for food security and food nutrition systems. We were already making these recommendations, but when the COVID-19 pandemic hit and we were working on this report, it just became extra clear to us that COVID-19 shines a light on why these kinds of shifts are really important for food security and nutrition policy. And this really applies to international assistance and aid as well, that we need to move in these kinds of directions to ensure that we're addressing this problem in a holistic and supportive way. So I know that's a lot, but a big slide. I will stop the share and I'll stop speaking, but happy to follow up on questions about these recommendations. Thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. Prachi, would you like to jump in?
Thanks. In terms of challenges of the data gaps, I mean, we're looking at it very, I think, you know, again, I'm arguing for a cross-sectoral health and education response in order to really think of sustainable, longer-term solutions for educational planning. I think educational planning in the last few decades, maybe last 2 decades, has not really received the kind of attention that it requires. And it's fallen out of favor, and it's not been very sexy, and it's quite boring, is kind of how people approach it. But what we're seeing now is that without those systems in place, and there are data systems. So one of the big pushes in the early 2000s was for countries to adopt strong EMIS systems, education management information systems. And most of the global data that you see published that are usually coming out of the UNESCO Institute for Statistics are collected locally in terms of education. What we're seeing in terms of gaps there is, if we're going to think about just first responses and medium-term responses to recovery, to societal reopening and recovery, we need to be very coordinated by matching almost at a catchment level of the health and education data. So for example, if we're just going to take the example of school reopenings, which is the big topic of conversation right now, how do we actually start thinking about reopening schools and schooling systems? I actually think it's premature in many contexts. That's my personal opinion. But in terms of looking at it, we want to look at it from a localized approach. And a localized approach means not just at a country level or a provincial or state level, but very much at a community level. What are the rates of infection within that community? What are the transportation patterns? What is the catchment area of that particular community? Where does that community draw its students from? And it gets complicated, but we need to be able to match those health data with disaggregated data at the individual level, very much along the lines of those identity attributes. Who are the children who are already at risk? We know schools actually do, in many instances, know who those students are. But is there a system to be able to link that in a more planned way? So who are the students that are coming from economically insecure households? Who are the children that are already on free school meals, for example? Who are the children that have individualized learning plans? Who are the children that are coming from instances that require further support? And how can we provide those services, either by reopening schools within those localized communities where it is safe to do so, or by providing targeted services to those households and to those schools? This is minutiae level planning. I mean, just by me saying it, I'm getting dizzy talking about it, right? It is minutiae level planning. It requires planning from the school, all the way from the level of the individual school with the individual school population, and then connecting it to the community, and then connecting it to the broader situation. The reason we need that is because in the vast majority of contexts globally, We are not in a situation where the virus has been sustainably controlled. We are not in that situation. We're also not in the situation where there is an effective treatment and a vaccine that has been rolled out generally to the population. We are very much in the vast majority there are, of course, exceptions. Vietnam is an exception. South Korea is an exception. Scotland now is almost going to be an exception. New Zealand is an exception. There are exceptions, but in the vast majority of cases, we are not there. So if we're not there, how do we look at reopening societies? It's not just about reopening schools. When we reopen schools, we're talking about reopening as a societal, as a package of measures that goes along with societal reopening. When we're talking about societal reopening in this context, we need very fine-grained data. And we need those data coming from the individual level. So how do we coordinate that? UNESCO Institute for Statistics has actually put out a brief. If people are interested, I can put up the link in our Q&A in terms of thinking about how we can very quickly approach rapid data collection and rapid analysis in terms of education and linking it with some of these other factors. And that might be one way of starting, but it really does expose the planning gaps that we have and the gaps that we have in existing data systems.
Great, thank you, Prachi, for that. Julia, would you like to come in?
Sure.
I just want to flag that we only have about 20 minutes left, and I do want to open up to Q&A, and we have a fourth question. So, but we'll get there, I'm sure. So, Julia.
I'll be brief. And I think in response to this question, the problem with data gaps around gender and all these other factors is that international assistance programming cannot support, and does not support what is not documented. So one data gap that I failed to mention in the last question was around gender minorities and transgender non-binary people. We have so little data on their experiences during this crisis, and therefore they're being, their experiences are not being supported, their specific needs are not being addressed. As I already mentioned also, we lack data on the informal work that's being done. And this, is not only about the informal work that women and men are doing, but in a lot of cases, a lot of informal work is being done by newcomers and migrants. And we need more data on that and, what their risk is to COVID infection because of their work. In a lot of cases, they're working on the front lines. And again, how that risk can be mitigated and what the economic losses mean for these groups if they're having economic loss. And then similarly, the lack of data and documentation of the care work that's mostly done by women. That again, this response to COVID is relying on unpaid care work that's mostly done by women. Children are not going to school, and it's mostly mothers or female caregivers that are caring for them. And I mean, everything would be a million times worse if it wasn't for that work that's going on. And so I think we really need to understand that in order to figure out how to support it and to mitigate those burdens and the long-term effects of women leaving the workforce or people giving up other opportunities because of care work. So those are some of the gaps in how I think they're really limiting the scope of international assistance. And I'll leave it there because I know we're short on time.
Great. So, bringing your collective remarks together, I see both a call for a need to really look in very detailed fashion at the minutiae of what's happening, but at the same time recognize that those details sit in very complex, interconnected systems. And so really, from thinking about the policymaker, it's really about thinking of the challenge at these two levels, the very local level and the much more systemic level. Okay, we'll push along to the last question, where here we have the last two questions. What are some considerations for connecting emerging evidence on the impacts of and responses to COVID-19 to policy actors and decision makers? And how can linkages between research and policy be strengthened to increase the effectiveness of international assistance? So I'm going to try and address these questions or kick off answering this question. And I mean, I should preface by saying these are largely based on my own experiences as opposed to evidence that I have gathered looking at the relationship between policy making and sort of research per se. But I think I'd like to identify 3 areas where we might want to think about bringing together research and policy. And I think I'll start off with perhaps the elephant in the room, which is funding. And I think it's not just about the amount of funding that we can offer, but it's also about the mechanisms we use to bring very germane policy questions of the day to researchers and encourage researchers to think about how they frame and communicate and engage with policymakers to shape that policy discussion and debate. So it's not purely a quantity amount, I want to be clear, but thinking about the strategic use of joint proposals, call for proposals, and the role of research councils across all research councils, not just necessarily the social sciences, which tends to often have host these joint proposals. I think there's some evidence of that happening in Canada. Certainly in the UK, that mechanism is used quite widely. The second area I wanted to draw attention to were the channels of communication and engagement. So conferences, webinars, really the opportunity to work on emerging briefs of the kind that Liam was alluding to was part of this partnership between GAC and CACID, I think are really important mechanisms, and we need more of them. And I think this webinar is the end in some sense of a partnership, but also perhaps the beginning of more ambition in the context of these channels. And then lastly, just to talk a little bit about culture and incentives. I think one needs kind of an openness and a desire to engage and to debate often questions that might be difficult, particularly on the policymaker side to discuss and engage with openly. So I would hope that we could foster levels of trust and openness and think about how we do that. I think COVID-19 is the perfect disruptor. There is an opportunity to create new normals in terms of those relationships. And I'd love to see that happen certainly here in Canada, but as well as elsewhere. So with that, does anyone else want to jump in with any thoughts? I'm looking at my screen. If anyone, I'm sure there's a few. Or Jennifer, great.
Yeah, just to say, I feel really fortunate that I've been able to be a member of the UN Committee on World Food Security's high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. Normally, that body is addressing problems that they're planning to do reports on 1 year, 2 years, 3 years out. But what was great was when the COVID pandemic emerged, we were able to do a really rapid issues paper, and the appetite for that among the governments who are members of the Committee on World Food Security was really strong. And they are asking us to update it and keep it updated to keep them informed. So it was, for me, that's a really positive sign that governments are really eager to gain the information coming from the research community. And yeah, just to say that I think more of these kinds of initiatives and mechanisms, like the CACID partnership with Global Affairs Canada, I think it's really important to keep those lines of dialogue open by having some sort of infrastructure or standing committees or bodies that can take on these issues when they emerge and pose crises like this.
I think one of the, building from what Jennifer and Nilamar are saying, I think one of the things that I have seen kind of emerge in the global education architecture is this great desire to actually connect outside of one's own sector, outside of one's own area of work. And I think that if we can institutionalize that a little bit more within our agencies, within our governments, and that might be a call. I am seeing right now in Ontario a call for, one of the recommendations that we're making is to have a cross-sectoral task force for education, which is supposed to outlive the idea that we're just in this pandemic for this short amount of time. It's to really think about planning in a much more cross-sectoral collaborative way, and to think about it from a long-term objective, so that if and when there are other crises, we know there are going to be other crises. There's climate change is it hasn't stopped just because we're now all focusing on COVID. It's there. And there will be other crises. There are other pandemics that might happen. There are other natural disasters that we don't know. But those institutionalizing that way of thinking within our structures, I think, is really what is required in order to connect the evidence. Because what I see is sometimes there's great evidence, and we're asking in terms of evidence to say that, you know what, there is going to be a call for more financing in certain sectors for certain kinds of activities. Are governments actually doing that? Right? It's also, those structures might actually help to make sure that there is some kind of accountability, some kind of engagement beyond just the traditional the traditional platforms that we've seen. So I hope that that is one thing that does get institutionalized as a result of this experience globally.
Great. Julia, do you have anything to quickly add?
I was just going to add, I think, you know, we also need to think of more innovative ways to engage. And I just wanted to share one example because it was an interesting partnership I was involved with Global Affairs, where together with the Department of National Defense, they organized a matrix game. And this was interesting because this happened in March 2019. And it was a simulation matrix game involving academic researchers, people from policy, from D&D. And our scenario was actually a SARS-like outbreak that occurred in China. And then we went through the, you know, at this simulation together, and I used it as a research output and a learning opportunity. And I think the other people that participated had a chance to put some of the learning around gender-based analysis plus and those sort of responses into action. And it was such an interesting experience. And I think we need more of those sort of co-learning opportunities that go beyond, you know, us talking heads here right now, in order to engage with each other and really learn from the challenges. Like, I really began to understand the challenges policymakers face in a new way when it comes to implementing gender-based analysis. And I think, you know, they also took some learning. So I just think there's, you know, we need to see more sort of innovative approaches to this co-learning and working together.
Great. So with that, I'd like to open up and try and bring some of the questions that we've had come in. And I'm going to look at these questions, I guess, in the number of votes that they've received to be as democratic as possible in choosing them. And I think, you know, there's one question. The first question here is from Roy Culpepper, and, you know, probably Jennifer, you might be best placed to answer it, but Julia, perhaps you as well. And the question is really about women's production of food. I'm sorry, let me just read it. In most of the developing world, women produce most of the food for households, but typically do not have legal rights to owning their land. Should women's rights and access to land be strengthened, not only to reduce gender inequality, but also to boost food security, particularly under Canada's FIAP? So Jennifer, Julia, or Prachi, do any of you want to start with that?
I don't mind. I'll just say quickly, yes. women's access to land and other productive resources for agriculture should be strengthened. One of the key points that we make in the HLPE report on food security and nutrition is that fundamental transformation of food systems needs to require, first and foremost, an improvement in the rights of food system participants, particularly for the most marginalized and vulnerable food system participants, and that includes women. And so I think that's extremely important that we improve rights to land, improve rights to the access to resources and credit, et cetera. So yes, that would be my short answer to that question, but I'm happy to circle back. I saw Roy asked some other questions as well about industrial agriculture, but I'll leave it there to let Julia respond.
That's fine. I just typed my answer, and my answer is also yes.
Sorry. We then have a question from Belinda Dodson, who's interested in the panel's views on proposals for global public finance and a shift to a more global as opposed to international framing and approaches to development and aid.
Anyone want to take a stab at that? Perhaps, I mean, I can try and answer that question. So I think this is really this idea of thinking beyond the narrow definition of aid to really think about finance more generally, and both the objectives of development as being wider, but also the mechanisms. I mean, my sense is there is a need to look beyond aid, that this potentially offers a way to think about accounting for effort overall. I think it also is a possibility of bringing the North and South back together at a table, which I think for too long has been a binary between, you know, Southern other and Northern kind of paternalism. And so I think the idea is also about addressing some of the underlying inequalities that have characterized this conversation, and truly making it a global one with horizontality and mutual respect. So I think there's a values element to the global finance investment idea, as well as a kind of mechanical kind of measurement issue. In principle, I think we need rethinking about the role of aid, and I think COVID really highlights the need to try and rethink it. And I think global public finance offers one approach. Prachi, you're on mic. Do you have anything to add?
I was just saying that with the humanitarian, there's now this humanitarian coalition that's you know, for COVID-19 as a financing structure. It showed some promise, but from what I'm seeing, I'm not entirely sure how the different. We're in a situation, at least in education, where there are now a multitude of funds for global education. And one of the issues is, how do we actually coordinate across the different funds? There's Education Cannot Wait, there's Education Outcomes Fund, there's of course the Global Partnership for Education, and there's this new one that's coming up, IFID. And of course, then there's bilateral financing, and then there's multilateral financing. All of these have, you know, different, some of them have different foci, some don't. But the issue then becomes, how do we actually coordinate for longer term sustainable financing cross-sectorally? And I'm not sure that we're there yet. I think that a new fund for COVID-19 was trying to get at that. But when you actually go, there is a link. I'll post the link on this. If you want to see the allocations, they're still very sectoral based in terms of where the money is going and what are the asks and how much has been received. So I'm not entirely sure how does that feed into the different financing architectures that are already there for different sectors, for different income group countries, for different loan mechanisms. I'm not entirely sure how all of that fits together. And people at OEI and Nilama's colleagues would probably, that's maybe something that they're looking into. But I think for macro planning, it does open a very different way of thinking about things. I don't know how we institutionalize that though.
Great. Another question we have here is from Lucy Goulet. And the question is, as researchers, what are the positives and the setbacks of localization of research under COVID-19? I heard a lot about shift of power and ownership, decentralization, which is great, but what other aspects of that shift in research are implied, especially on monitoring and evaluation, data gathering? Anyone have any thoughts on that one?
I can jump in here. I think these are questions that the project I'm working with, is trying to answer right now as we go forward. And there's this, when it comes to gender-based analysis, the need to be localized and culturally specific and grounded in context is so incredibly important. Interesting, what we're seeing across a lot of the contexts we're working in is very similar trends that really demonstrate, I would say, the influence of the global political economy and other structures in shaping the gender inequities that are being experienced in response to COVID. And so there's a need for kind of two levels of analysis, which I know is not a revolutionary statement. There's always need for two levels of analysis. But the challenge of getting, I'd say, the localized and context-specific data rapidly as it's being demanded is immense. And I think in a lot of contexts, everybody is also overworked. and dealing with the pandemic. And so we're, you know, and I think many of us can speak to this, that we're engaged in this urgent research at the same time as dealing with the chaos the pandemic is causing in our lives. And in some contexts, that's more so. And so there's power differentials there that also need to be considered about who has the capacity to do the research, to collect the data where it needs to be collected, and how that is shaping issues around ownership and decentralization. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else, or should I move to probably the last question of the session? Okay, so this one here I think is very specific, and it's addressed to Jennifer. And it says, you are right, often the issue is from demand side, as we are seeing that more from the evidence coming out from different parts of the world. Weak demand, cautionary expenditure, and lack of cash are important impediments to demand. Supply has been less of a problem. How do you think that a convergence in demand and supply can be maintained in this situation?
Right, thanks. That's a great question. And I think, I mean, historically, we've tended to think about food and food assistance in this kind of global context of world food supplies and demand, you know, people's ability to pay for it. But we need to also start to think about making food systems more resilient within local regions and territories, so that we can have that better balance between supply and demand. So rather than talking about global cereal stocks, which by the way, something like 75% of global cereal stocks are held in just 7 countries, and the vast proportion in just a couple of countries, very far distant from the countries that are most at risk, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. So rather than trying to think about how do we get, you know, grain stocks from China and India into sub-Saharan Africa countries, I think what we need to talk about is how do we make food systems within sub-Saharan African countries more resilient, to keep, in a sense, the funding and the investment local to provide livelihoods which enable people to be able to access food from local and regional markets as opposed to buying on international markets. And it's a big shift, because for many, many decades, we've talked about global food security in this big kind of macro context, and how do we get aid from the surplus countries to the countries that are in deficit. And instead, I think we need to think more about reinvigorating and revitalizing local food sheds all around the world. And it is a big shift, and maybe it goes against the interests of some of the big agribusiness players who benefit from the global movement of food, but I think it's super important, and that's why that's one of the big policy shifts that we are calling for from the HLPE. And just in a political sense, I think countries are looking now more towards self-sufficiency in PPE for health, but also self-sufficiency in terms of food production. And I don't think we should look at self-sufficiency as necessarily in a negative light, because for years economists have said this is inefficient and we shouldn't go there. But actually, politically, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of governments to do just-in-case planning instead of just-in-time planning. So we need to prioritize resilience over efficiency. And I think that's a direction we're moving in. And I think that's a positive one, but it's a long road, and it takes investment to build that kind of local and regional infrastructure. But I think it's something that aid agencies should really be supporting and thinking about. Thanks.
Thank you. So with that, I think I'd like to draw this to a close. I think what I take away from this is really that this crisis is drawing the interests of development policymakers and researchers closer than ever. And with that, I guess I want to apologize for not being able to answer all the questions or address all the questions, but special thanks also to Global Affairs Canada and to CACID for putting on this event. And I wish you well. And just to mention that the AGM, I believe, is going to be starting in a few minutes online for those of you who want to log on to that. And of course, thank you to each of the panelists for really addressing these questions in such a way that brings both the nuance and the complexity to bear on them. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Nalima. We greatly appreciate everybody taking the time to share their insights and their thoughts on these important questions with us today. Jennifer, Prachi, Julia, Nalima, we greatly appreciate your contribution. And CACID is very grateful too to the support of Global Affairs for putting on this session as part of our ongoing research initiative with them. As Nalima mentioned, the CACID annual general meeting will be commencing momentarily for those of you who are CACID members, and you will have been sent that link for that meeting. So if you can't get enough CACID, please join us for that. In the meantime, thank you to everyone who joined us online. I saw who's who of global affairs officers and development researchers from across Canada online. I hope you all took away from our discussion as much as I feel I did in this case. Thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.